Thank you for joining us for another episode of Scientifically Speaking in conjunction with Practical Dermatology and Modern Aesthetics magazines. I'm Dr. Joel Cohen from Denver, Colorado, and I am excited that in this edition of Scientifically Speaking, we are going to be talking about sunscreen and photo protection with Dr. Teresa Michele from the Food and Drug Administration, as well as Dr. Stephen Wang from Memorial Sloan Kettering. I'm really excited today to be talking about sunscreen with Dr. Teresa Michele from the FDA. So she is joining us to specifically address some of the discussions that we've had about sunscreen safety and efficacy and the way that regulatory approval actually happens for specific products. So Dr. Michele, thanks for joining us, and tell us a little bit about your hat and your sun protection this morning.
So thanks for having me today. So obviously, if we're talking about sunscreens, it doesn't stop with just the bottle. You have to follow the other sun protective measures, which include hats. So that's why this is my favorite hat, because it's got a broad brim and plenty of sun protection for your neck and your ears. And of course, sunglasses too.
Love it. Thank you for doing that. That's really important. And my hat this morning is the 10th Mountain Division, who trained in Colorado for many years during World War II to really prepare for the Northern Italy campaign. And this is exactly where I take my kids, and I took them this past weekend, ATV riding and dirt biking. So it's a special place for my family. And we are very rigorous about our sun protection there. We are wearing wide brim hats, sunscreen with zinc. We're wearing sunglasses, and we're going to talk a little bit about that right now. So Dr. Michele, can you tell us about the FDA's role in ensuring the quality of sunscreen products?
Sure. So as every dermatologist knows, skin cancer rates continue to rise, which makes reducing risk from excess sun exposure a real important public health priority, and one that we at FDA are very concerned about. So when used as directed with other sun protective measures like the hat and the sunglasses, broad spectrum sunscreens with SPF values of at least 15 reduce the risk for skin cancer and protect the skin from sunburn. And so now with those factors, sunscreens are being used far more frequently. And so they're being used in larger amounts and by broader populations. It's more important than ever that we ensure that sunscreens are safe and effective for daily, lifelong use. So similar to other over-the-counter drugs, FDA regulates sunscreens to ensure that they meet safety and effectiveness standards, which address the product as a whole, not just the active ingredients. Like other over-the-counter drugs, sunscreen manufacturers have to comply with current good manufacturing processes, and FDA also specifies the tests that a sunscreen must pass to determine its labeled SPF value, as well as to support a broad spectrum or water resistance claim.
So we'll talk about some of these issues specifically, but you mentioned that more people are wearing sunscreen. And as a skin cancer surgeon, specifically a Mohs surgeon, most of my work is done on the face with skin cancer removal and reconstruction. And it's really surprising to see the newer data that actually shows that many people with a history of skin cancer are not wearing sunscreen and not wearing sunscreen regularly at all. So can you tell us about the data from a safety standpoint about the active ingredients in sunscreen?
Sure. This is something that FDA has been actively working on. And in February of 2019, we published our evaluation of the available data for over-the-counter sunscreens and proposed some measures to improve the safety, efficacy, and quality of sunscreens. So we indicated that the publicly available data support the safety and effectiveness of two active ingredients, namely zinc oxide and titanium dioxide for use in sunscreens. We also indicated that there are two active ingredients, aminobenzoic acid or PABA and trolamine salicylate, that are not safe. And those two active ingredients, fortunately, aren't really used in US sunscreens today. We also indicated that there are 12 active ingredients for which we need additional data to support the safety. Now, to supply that active and additional data, we identified a combination of both clinical and non-clinical safety studies. One of those is a human absorption study, which is also known as a maximal use study or a MUST, which is used to determine the concentration of the sunscreen's active ingredients in the plasma after applying the sunscreen according to the product labeling on the skin. Now, understanding that systemic absorption of a drug, such as a sunscreen, is one of the key features to evaluate safety.
I'm glad you mentioned absorption. The FDA published in conjunction with some other physicians in JAMA in spring of 2019, two studies that really looked at absorption of some of the chemical ingredients. And although it was surprising in that article, or both articles really, to see that the absorption was higher than anticipated for some of these chemical ingredients, it didn't really extrapolate that this was a safety issue. And this is a conversation I have every day with my patients. So I'm hoping you can shed some light on that, specifically in reference to these studies.
Glad you brought that up, Dr. Cohen. So because maximal usage trials had not been performed previously for sunscreens, FDA conducted 2 trials to demonstrate the feasibility of these studies and to collect some preliminary data that covered multiple commercial formulations with 7 different active ingredients. As you mentioned, the study showed that all 7 of these active ingredients were absorbed in appreciable quantities. Now, the fact that these ingredients are absorbed systemically does not mean that they're unsafe. Rather, what this finding means is that it calls for further testing to determine the safety of those ingredients for repeated use over a lifetime, which is what we're asking consumers to do with their sunscreens. Chronic use testing is part of the standard pre-market safety for most chronically administered drugs that have any kind of appreciable systemic absorption. And data about the absorption of the active ingredients can then be used with other safety testing to inform the overall benefit risk of the drug. So while these data are being collected, the public should continue to use broad spectrum sunscreens with SPFs of at least 15 or higher, along with all the other good sun protective measures because of the known benefits of sunscreen use.
Okay. So as a dermatologist who's married to a pediatrician with 3 young kids, there's always discussions and I'm always fielding questions specifically about the safety of sunscreen in kids, and it has to do with that absorption and the safety specifically in infants. So starting with infants, can you really walk us through some of the issues and some of the discussion and recommendations at different ages?
Sunscreens are not generally recommended for infants less than 6 months of age, in contrast with all other age groups where the recommendations are the same as for adults. Keeping infants in the shade and having them wear protective clothing are the best ways to protect infants from the sun. Sunscreen labels direct consumers to ask a doctor before use in infants younger than 6 months of age. And that's where dermatologists can step in to provide recommendations.
So, and that's a really helpful distinction, that ask a doctor, because people presume that under 6 months is a question about safety. And, we obviously tell people avoid direct sunlight. If a kid is in a carrier or something, you can orient this so that there's protection from the sun. You can put them in the shade, keep an eye on them. But I have no problem with putting zinc on somebody for particularly exposed areas of the face if need be in a certain situation, because this is zinc that we actually are using for diaper dermatitis and those types of creams as well. So it's not a safety standpoint. I think really it refers to the fact that these infants have not developed their ability to thermoregulate. And if you cover them with sunscreen at a particular point, then you may actually change the ability to adjust to different temperatures. So seek the shade, wear sun protective clothing, and then for small areas, if need be, zinc, in my opinion, is something that they can go ahead and do for small areas. And I know that pediatricians agree with that, including my wife. So if we look to other questions specifically about, it's been a long time since any specifically new ingredients were approved in the US by the FDA. Can you talk to us about the approval process and why some things that have been in Europe for many years are not here yet?
Sure. So, because sunscreens are intended to prevent sunburn, and some also are intended to decrease the risk of skin cancer and early skin aging caused by the sun, they're regulated as drugs in the United States. In recent years, as you mentioned, there's been growing interest in sunscreen active ingredients that have been used in products marketed in Europe, but that those ingredients cannot currently be included in most sunscreens marketed in the United States without an approved drug application. In Europe, sunscreens are regulated as cosmetics, which is different from the United States. And as cosmetics, they have very different requirements for marketing as opposed to drugs. So there's been a total of 8 sunscreen active ingredients used in products marketed in Europe that have been proposed for inclusion in United States sunscreens. FDA has identified the missing data for these 8 ingredients, and we've provided those evaluations to manufacturers in feedback letters. We look forward to working with the manufacturers as they provide the data that's needed to assess whether these sunscreens could be marketed in the United States. Manufacturers also have the option to market a sunscreen with a different active ingredient by obtaining approval from FDA, which establishes the safety and effectiveness of that particular specific sunscreen formulation. And we've approved a few sunscreens this way.
Okay. So if we don't assume that everybody out there from a medical and healthcare perspective understands the SPF testing, can you briefly describe the lab study and what it means for consumers specifically related to SPF?
Sure. So SPF stands for sun protection factor. This indicates the level of sunburn protection provided by the sunscreen product. Now, because SPF values represent a sunscreen's level of sunburn protection, they're primarily, although not exclusively, an indicator of the expected protection from UVB radiation. There's a popular misconception that SPF relates to time of solar exposure, and that's not true. SPF is not directly related to time, but to the amount of solar exposure. So the SPF number does not tell you how long you can stay out in the sun. What it actually measures is the amount of UV radiation exposure that it takes to cause sunburn when a person is using a sunscreen compared to how much UV exposure it takes to cause sunburn when a person is not using a sunscreen. So the SPF test is actually a clinical study using a solar simulator to administer several specified doses of UV radiation that increase by 15 to 25% with each successive dose to a human subject's back in both sunscreen treated and sunscreen not treated areas. The investigator then visually evaluates both the treated and the untreated areas to identify the first place where there's perceptible skin redness that has clearly defined borders. The investigator records the smallest dose of UV radiation that it took to create an area with observed skin reaction of erythema with clearly defined borders. And then after assessing multiple subjects, the resulting UV exposure information is then translated into an SPF value.
So our patients and the public out there in general seems so fixated on higher and higher SPFs. And this is something I spend a lot of time fielding with my patients every day as a fellowship trained Mohs surgeon, as well as somebody who did a fellowship in aesthetics. I'm spending all my time either doing skin cancer or laser resurfacing for lines and wrinkles or pigmentation. And I think that really there's some clarity that needs to happen when people understand some of these values. And can you talk to us about some ways that UVA may be more clearly understood in the future? Because people don't realize that these high SPF sunscreens, first of all, are things that taper off in terms of efficacy. And then secondly, that these SPF sunscreens are really protecting the UVB spectrum and not the UVA spectrum. And we know that UVA are longer wavelengths and they lead to pigmentation, they lead to sun damage and changes, in particular collagenase and some of these enzymatic changes that lead to lines and wrinkles specifically. So what is the FDA doing to make UVA more clear? It passes through driver's side windows, et cetera, and a lot of people just don't realize that.
So dermatologists can really help explain to their patients about sunscreens. We know that all sunscreens are labeled with an SPF value, but that SPF value isn't all that consumers should look for. As of June 2011, sunscreens that pass the broad spectrum test have the option to include the phrase broad spectrum on their labels in tandem with the SPF value. And that's something that consumers should always look for. So to support having that labeled indication of broad spectrum, sunscreens have to demonstrate that they also provide a degree of UVA protection. Only products that have been demonstrated to both provide broad spectrum protection and have a minimum SPF of 15 or higher have been shown to reduce the risk of skin cancer and early skin aging caused by the sun when used as directed with other sun protective measures. But by contrast, sunscreens that have not been demonstrated to provide both broad spectrum protection and have an SPF value of at least 15 can't carry that claim, and they have to carry a warning that the product has not been shown to prevent skin cancer.
So we started out this segment speaking specifically about zinc and titanium, and I just want to bring that into the discussion about broad spectrum, because if we look at the wavelengths from UVB 290 to 320 and then UVA from 320 to 400, there's a lot of area 320 to 400, and many of these sunscreens that are labeled broad spectrum don't extend as far out in the spectrum towards 400 as, say, zinc or titanium. So can you talk to us a little bit about what is required and what is done in the testing for broad spectrum?
Sure. So the current labeling requirements for sunscreen labeled as broad spectrum is that they have to achieve a critical wavelength of 370 nanometers or greater. This critical wavelength means that it is the wavelength corresponding to 90% of the area under the curve. Higher critical wavelengths, therefore, illustrate a greater breadth of that UVA protection across the whole 290 to 400 spectrum. So although we currently permit that, we are concerned, as you mentioned, that not all sunscreens are required to meet this specification. And because of the growing body of evidence linking UVA exposure to skin cancer has grown so much in the past few years, we're concerned about the potential for inadequate UVA protection, particularly with very high SPF sunscreens that don't have the broad spectrum and uniformity across their whole UVA spectrum. So in 2019, we indicated that we would like to redesign these requirements to couple UVA protection to increases in SPF value. So changes we considered in 2019 are requiring all sunscreens with SPF 15 and above to satisfy broad spectrum requirements, and adding a requirement to the current broad spectrum test that broad spectrum products must meet a UVA1 to UV ratio of 0.7 or higher, which would ensure that as the SPF increases, the broad spectrum also increases, and that broad spectrum products provide adequate protection against UVA.
Dr. Michele, I think there's still a lot of misperceptions for people about water resistance. They sort of take the extension of that and say that it's waterproof. And I very clearly tell patients that I want you to reapply if you're swimming, sweating, or toweling off more frequently than the 2 hours that are recommended. Can you touch on some of the testing for water resistance?
So you can tell your patients that there is no such thing as a waterproof sunscreen because all of them eventually wash off. Sunscreens that are labeled as water resistant are required to be tested according to the SPF test procedure after repeated immersion in water. Then sunscreen labels are required to state whether the sunscreen remains effective after immersion in water for 40 minutes or for 80 minutes when swimming or sweating. So if you've been in the water, you need to reapply at the stated time on the sunscreen label, either 40 minutes or 80 minutes. And of course, if you towel off, you need to reapply then because you're wiping the sunscreen off.
We're constantly getting questions from colleagues or patients and family members and people in the community, obviously, about sun protection. Dr. Michele, are there specific resources and websites from the FDA that we can relay people to so that they can actually engage in some of the material that we discussed today?
Yes. So dermatologists can refer people to learn more about sun protection and sunscreens on the FDA website. We even have a really fun quiz that consumers can take to test their knowledge of sunscreen facts.
Obviously, we want patients to wear sunscreen. We want them to choose sunscreen with the right ingredients, and we want them to reapply. Many people keep it with them for convenience, whether it's in their purse or a backpack or their car. And obviously, there's a lot of issues related to storage. And I'd like for you to really talk about that because we want people to be using sunscreen that's still obviously effective.
Right. So FDA regulations require that all sunscreens have an expiration date unless stability testing conducted by the manufacturer has shown that the product will remain stable for at least 3 years. That means that a sunscreen product that doesn't have an expiry date should be considered expired 3 years after purchase, and expired sunscreens should be discarded because there's no assurance that they remain fully effective. So in terms of storage, sunscreen containers should never be exposed to direct sun. You should protect your sunscreen by wrapping the containers in towels, keeping them in the shade, or what's my favorite is to pop your sunscreen in the cooler when you're going to the beach. If you're storing your sunscreen in a hot environment, such as a car, just be aware that it may degrade faster than the expiry date.
So for our family, again, dermatologists married to a pediatrician, we have a little checklist when we go places, particularly hiking. So wide brim hats, sunglasses, UPF long sleeve shirts, and then sunscreen that we take out. And as you would imagine, everybody has a different preference in my family. So, you know, some people like the way one looks or feels or rubs in better or smells. So there's a lot of things to keep track of, but you know, it's important that we all get on that right page about using sunscreen, using it effectively. We're on a mission to hopefully control the rates of skin cancer. And it's really helpful to have you here today discussing sunscreen and sun protection with us from the FDA perspective. So thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us for Scientifically Speaking in conjunction with Practical Dermatology